Howdy, folks. Think the Wild West was all shootouts at high noon, saloons overflowing with whiskey, and cowboys with perfect aim? Well, hold your horses. Today we're diving headfirst into the muck and mire of history to bust some of the biggest myths about the Old West. And trust me, the truth is a whole lot grittier and more interesting than the movies let on. Hang on and watch the vintage photos all the way to the end. We're talking about the real stories of the men and women who lived, worked, and sometimes died on the frontier. We'll separate fact from fiction and maybe even learn a thing or two about hard work, resilience, and the real meaning of the Wild West. So saddle up, partners, and get ready for a wild ride. Now, I've worked my fair share of dirty jobs, but being a gunslinger in the Wild West, that's one gig I'd steer clear of. See, Hollywood would have you believe everyone and their grandma was packing heat, ready to draw at the drop of a hat. Truth is, most towns back then had stricter gun control laws than some places do today. Yep, you heard that right. Many towns required folks to check their iron at the city limits. They didn't want any accidental discharges turning their saloons into shooting galleries, and those infamous shootouts, the gunfight at the OK Corral, the one everyone talks about, it lasted about 30 seconds and involved a grand total of 30 shots fired. Don't get me wrong, it was a tragedy, but it wasn't exactly a scene from the good, the bad, and the ugly. The truth is, most folks out west weren't looking for trouble. They were just trying to make a living. They were farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, teachers, everyday people trying to build a life for themselves. They worked hard, they played hard, and they understood the value of a hard-earned dollar. They weren't gunslingers. They were builders, pioneers, and risk-takers, and they did it all without the luxury of air conditioning or smartphones. So next time you see a movie about the Wild West, remember it's probably got more to do with Hollywood magic than historical accuracy, because the real Wild West was built by hard-working folks, not quick-drawing gunslingers. Now let's talk about cowboys, those iconic figures of the American West. You picture a cowboy, you probably see a rugged white dude in a Stetson, right? Well, hold on to your hats, because the reality is a whole lot more diverse. That turns out the Wild West was more of a melting pot than a John Wayne movie. You had black cowboys, Hispanic cowboys, even Asian cowboys, all riding the range and contributing to the frontier spirit. In fact, nearly a quarter of all cowboys were black. These were former slaves and freemen who headed west after the Civil War, seeking opportunity and a fresh start. They were some of the most skilled horsemen and cattlemen around. And let's not forget the vaqueros. These Mexican cowboys were the original trailblazers, teaching the newcomers a thing or two about roping and riding. They were the backbone of the cattle industry, and their influence is still felt today. Even Native Americans played a vital role in the cowboy life. They were expert trackers, hunters, and knew the land better than anyone. And let's not forget the Chinese immigrants who helped build the railroads that connected the West to the rest of the nation. So the next time you think about cowboys, remember, it wasn't just one type of person who tamed the Wild West. It was a diverse group of people from all walks of life working together, sometimes clashing, but ultimately shaping the character of the American frontier. All right, I'll admit, the Wild West wasn't exactly a picnic. Life was tough, resources were scarce, and danger lurked around every corner. But was it a lawless free-for-all like in the movies? Not by a long shot. Sure, there were outlaws and bandits, but most folks were just trying to get by, same as today. And believe it or not, most towns had some form of law and order. They had sheriffs, judges, even jails, though they might have been a little more rustic than what we're used to. Now, vigilante justice did exist, I won't deny that. Sometimes when the law was slow or non-existent, folks took matters into their own hands, but even then, it wasn't always as cut and dry as the movies make it seem. The truth is, crime rates in many western towns were actually lower than in some big cities back east. Shocking, right? Seems like all that fresh air and wide open space might have had a calming effect on folks. Of course, there were still disputes, disagreements, and the occasional saloon brawl. But for the most part, people understood the need for rules and consequences. They knew that a community, even a rough-and-tumble frontier community, couldn't survive without some semblance of order. Chapter 4 Myth: Busted people drank in saloons all day. Now let's talk about those infamous saloons. Hollywood loves to portray them as dens of iniquity. with whiskey flowing like water and card games going on 24/7. And while there's no denying that saloons were a big part of frontier life, the reality was a little less dramatic. First off, saloons weren't just for drinking. They were often the social hubs of their communities, serving as everything from post offices and hotels to, believe it or not, churches on Sundays. Talk about multi-purpose. And while folks did enjoy a drink or two, most people weren't stumbling around drunk all day. Remember, life on the frontier was hard work. You couldn't exactly wrangle cattle or build a homestead with a hangover. Let's talk about that whiskey for a second. It wasn't exactly top-shelf stuff. In fact, it was often homemade, poorly distilled, and probably tasted about as good as it sounds. Think burn and medicinal regret. The truth is, many settlers lived surprisingly sober lives. Women, especially, were often at the forefront of the temperance movement, advocating for moderation or even complete abstinence from alcohol. So while those saloon doors did swing open a lot, they weren't portals to non-stop debauchery. They were places to catch up on news, conduct business, and maybe enjoy a little entertainment after a long day's work. Just hold the rock gut whiskey. Hold the... Chapter 5. Myth-busted gold was everywhere gold. The very word conjures up images of dusty prospectors striking it rich, rivers overflowing with nuggets, and everyone walking around with pockets full of riches. Well, I hate to break it to you, but the reality of the gold rush was a lot less glamorous. Those gold rushes, yeah, they were more like gold sprints, short, intense bursts of activity that often fizzled out as quickly as they began. And while some folks did strike it lucky, the vast majority barely made enough to scrape by. The real winners of the gold rush weren't the prospectors themselves, but the savvy business owners who sold them shovels, picks, and those iconic metal pans. They knew the real gold was in supplying the dream, not chasing it. The average prospector spent long, grueling hours bent over a creek bed, sifting through tons of dirt and gravel for a few flecks of gold. It was backbreaking, often thankless work, and the odds of striking it rich were about as good as finding a clean pair of socks in a prospector's tent. So, while the lure of gold drew thousands west, it wasn't the guaranteed ticket to fortune that many had hoped for. It was a test of endurance, a gamble against long odds, and a stark reminder that even in the Wild West, there was no such thing as easy money. Chapter 6. Myth busted. Women were just saloon girls. Alright, last myth we're tackling today is a big one. See, Hollywood loves to portray women in the Old West as either delicate damsels in distress or, well, saloon girls. But let me tell you, the women of the Wild West were anything but helpless. These were tough, resourceful women who could handle a rifle, bake a pie in a Dutch oven, and stand toe-to-toe with any man. They were ranchers, business owners, doctors, teachers, you name it, a woman was doing it. In fact, some frontier towns had a higher percentage of independent women than cities back east. The Homestead Act allowed anyone, regardless of gender, to claim 160 acres of land, and many women, single and widowed, took advantage of this opportunity to build a life for themselves on their own terms. Take Annie Oakley, for example. She was a sharpshooter who could outshoot any man in the West, and her skills made her a legend. Or Stagecoach Mary, a fearless mail carrier who braved bandits, blizzards, and wild animals to deliver the post. These women weren't afraid of hard work, they weren't afraid to challenge conventions, and they certainly weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. They were pioneers in every sense of the word, and their contributions to the Wild West are too often overlooked. So, next time you see a movie set in the Old West, remember the women weren't just standing on the sidelines. They were out there shaping the frontier, one homestead, one business, one bullet at a time. Outro, the real Wild West. So there you have it, folks. The Wild West wasn't just gunfights and cowboy cliches. It was a complex, diverse, and often contradictory time in American history. It was a time of hardship and opportunity, of violence and progress, and of myth-making on a grand scale. Sure, it had its share of outlaws and legends, but for the most part, the Wild West was built by ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, and, yes, even cowboys, who were just trying to make a living and build a better life for themselves and their families. Like weird history and myth-busting. Hit that subscribe button and giddy up to the next video.